Random House Audio presents The Oil Kings: How the U.S., Iran, and Saudi Arabia Changed the Balance of Power in the Middle East, by Andrew Scott Cooper, read for you by Rob Shapiro. Introduction. Why should I plant a tree whose bitter root will only serve to nourish poison fruit? Abul Qasim Ferdowsi, The Persian Book of Kings. On November 25, 2006, U.S. Vice President Dick Cheney flew to Riyadh for talks with King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, the elderly autocrat whose desert kingdom is home to 1/5 of the world's proven oil reserves and is the largest producer within OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, the oil producers' cartel. The king was evidently in need of reassurance from his American allies. Earlier in the month, the U.S. war effort in Iraq had been dealt a setback after voters in midterm elections routed Republican incumbents and turned control of the Congress over to Democrats. Almost immediately, President George W. Bush accepted the resignation of Cheney's partner in power, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, and offered to find common ground with critics of his administration's handling of the war. For the first time in 6.5 years, the talk in Washington was not of victory in Iraq, but of an orderly withdrawal of coalition forces. The Saudis expressed concern that their neighbor and historic rival, Iran, would take advantage of the U.S. departure to assert its regional ambitions. Saudi Arabia's ambassador to Washington, Prince Turki al-Faisal, bluntly reminded the White House that, since America came into Iraq uninvited, it should not leave Iraq uninvited. The price of oil also came up in the vice president's meeting with Saudi officials. Over the summer of 2006, world energy markets had tightened, driving prices to record levels. Soaring fuel prices threatened America's prosperity and the economies of its trading partners. Oil as high as $78 a barrel also posed a challenge to U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, where oil producers reaped windfall profits. The Bush White House was especially concerned about what the government of Iran would do with its new billions. Iran's profits from oil rose last year to more than $45 billion from $15 billion, surging at a rate not seen since 1974, when the country's oil revenues tripled, reported the New York Times. The surge in Iranian oil profits was accompanied by a marked upswing in regional tensions and violence that included a ferocious month-long war fought in Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah, the Shia group whose leaders received political cover and financial and military backing from Tehran. The prospect of President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad using his country's oil revenues to speed up Iran's nuclear program, strengthen the Iranian military, and arm Hezbollah in Lebanon, the radical Hamas Islamic group based in Gaza, and pro-Iranian Shia militias in Iraq, was anathema to officials in Washington and Riyadh. The Saudi royal family had seen this before. Back in the 1970s, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi of Iran had been the driving force behind high oil prices that he hoped would transform Iran into an economic and military powerhouse. Only the 1979 Islamic Revolution had put paid to the Shah's ambitions to dominate the Persian Gulf, West Asia, and the Indian Ocean. Although President Ahmadinejad would have never dared admit it, there were striking parallels between his effort to project Iranian petropower under the guise of pan-Islamism and the Shah's earlier drive to revive Iran's long-dormant Persian aspirations. Their strategic visions overlapped in ways that suggested some striking continuities. Both leaders saw Iran as the regional hegemon. They identified oil revenues and nuclear power as the keys to attaining international stature and domestic self-reliance. They relished provoking the same Western powers that, at one time, had treated Iran like a colonial vassal. Perhaps their most obvious shared trait was a King Midas complex. Like the Shah, Ahmadinejad was a big spender. who believed that high oil prices freed him from the need to practice fiscal restraint. Critics said that his plans for generous spending to create jobs and increase salaries were politically motivated and fiscally unsound, noted one observer. His budget relied on high oil profits likely to invite inflation. The Iranian central bank proposed a $40 billion fiscal stimulus that included subsidies for families and newlyweds. Ahmadinejad's spendthrift ways presented King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia with a golden opportunity. With petroleum responsible for 80% of income from exports, Iran's economy was perilously exposed to an unexpected price fluctuation in the oil markets. Tehran confidently expected consumer demand for oil to stay high, guaranteeing equally high prices. But what would happen to Iran's budget assumptions if oil prices suddenly plunged? Oil-producing countries base their spending plans and financial estimates on oil prices not falling below a certain threshold. If prices do suddenly plunge below that level, and if producers have not left themselves with enough of a financial cushion to absorb the blow from lost export receipts, the potential exists for a fiscal meltdown. Billions of dollars in anticipated revenue would disappear. Tehran would be forced to economize and decide whether to spend money on guns or butter, whether to lavish aid on Hezbollah and Hamas, or to prop up the complex system of food, fuel, housing, and transportation subsidies that keeps Iran's middle class in check. Removing the subsidies would increase the potential for protests and clashes between security forces and opposition groups. Only one country had the means and the motive to engineer a price correction on that scale. With its giant petroleum reserves and untapped production capacity, Saudi Arabia could flood the market by pumping enough surplus crude into the system to break the pricing structure and drive prices back down. The Saudi royal family has always understood that petropower is about more than creating wealth, developing its economy and preserving power. Oil is also the Saudis' primary weapon of national self-defense and the key to their security and survival. Flooding the market is economic warfare on a grand scale, the oil industry's equivalent of dropping the bomb on arrival. A flooded market and lower prices would inevitably result in billions of dollars in lost revenues to the Saudis. However, the threat from Iran was seen as outweighing that loss, and by late 2006, King Abdullah was prepared to tap Saudi oil reserves. A member of the Saudi royal family with knowledge of the discussions between Mr. Cheney and King Abdullah said the king had presented Mr. Cheney with a plan to raise oil production to force down the price in hopes of causing economic turmoil for Iran without becoming directly involved in a confrontation, reported the New York Times. Flooding the market would force Iran to slow the flow of funds to Hezbollah in Lebanon and to Shiite militias in Iraq without getting directly involved in a confrontation. The Saudis may also have had in mind a second motive. From past experience, they knew that if oil prices stayed too high for too long, the United States would be forced to reduce its consumption of foreign oil and take steps to encourage energy conservation and diversification. Less reliance on Saudi oil would translate into a reduction in Saudi strategic leverage over U.S. policy toward Israel and the Middle East. On November 29, 2006, 4 days after Cheney's return to Washington, the Washington Post published an essay by Nawaf Obaid, a prominent security advisor to the Saudi government and adjunct fellow at Washington's Center for Strategic and International Studies. Obaid's article warned that one of the consequences of a sudden U.S. withdrawal from Iraq would be massive Saudi intervention to stop Iranian-backed Shiite militias from butchering Iraqi Sunnis. Obaid reminded his readers that as the economic powerhouse of the Middle East, the birthplace of Islam, and the de facto leader of the world's Sunni community, which comprises 85% of Muslims,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?